kia ora koutou. So this is my presentation, Healing and Transforming Historical Heritage. So I'm going to start with this trauma definition. It's an emotional wound or shock that creates substantial lasting damage to the psychological development of the person. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that definition and I'm going to superimpose it over the Treaty of Waitangi. So we all know this part, so what I want to do is move to the agreement. And what it highlights is that we agreed to have a governor here in New Zealand. We agreed to the rights of British people. We agreed to trade and technology. We also agreed to share our land and resources with the settlers. But it was also acknowledged that we would keep our sovereignty, our customary native title, our lands designated for Māori, our customs, our beliefs, and our culture. So this is what we agreed to, but this is what happened. So when they formed the government, they used legislation to attack us in 3 areas. In our lands and our resources, by blocking all forms of redress or accountability to their fraudulent actions, and utilise legislation to assimilate and subjugate our culture, our language, and our identity. So in my chapter, how I talk about locating myself in my research, I was asking myself these questions. So what do the historical implications of the Treaty of Waitangi violations mean to me? Actually, at the time, it meant nothing because I hadn't connected it to my current context. From a societal perspective, I asked myself, how come Māori deficits are so high in New Zealand society? From an institutional perspective, I recognise that immigrants get better access to resources than Māori do. But what was most profound for me, from a personal perspective, I asked myself, so what do the impacts of the Treaty of Waitangi violations mean? And at the time it meant nothing at all. And it meant nothing due to the fact that I didn't know my culture, my identity, and my language. And so what it was about going on and doing a bit of research. And then I went into the Treaty of Waitangi violations, and then I superimposed them over 4 generations of my family. And then as a result, stories came through which were beyond my comprehension at the time. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit about that. So this is a photo, and it's right in the middle is the New Zealand Prime Minister at the time. This photo was taken in 1892, and it's Richard Snedden. Beside him is King Mahuta, and beside him is my great-grandfather, Te Kuri Te Nahu Waratini Wetini. So I'm just going to share with you this story. So he was born in 1840. He fought against the British Empire during the Waikato invasions, where he lost, where millions of acres of land were confiscated. He went into exile with King Tāwhiao. He fought alongside Iwi Manipuka and Tūhoe at Ōrākau Pā, and he was the spiritual advisor to King Mahuta, King Tarata, and Princess Tapoia. He passed away in 1940. So my grandfather was brought up, he was born in 1920 in the aftermath of World War I. He was born into the global influenza epidemic. He was beaten and abused for speaking his language in schools. And so he moved away from Māori culture. He joined Western religion, and to this day, none of his children speak Māori or even know Māori culture. And so when my father was brought up, he wasn't taught any tikanga, he wasn't taught any values. He found Māori culture inferior. So he chose his friends over his family and beat and abused his children. And so when I grew up with no identity. I grew up not knowing my language, my culture. I was brought up by the state. And so for me it was about deciding to change the cycle. I chased an education and went on to rediscover my cultural heritage. So what I took from that was this quote from Daniel Campbell, and he says, "The psychology of oppression is a process of mental, physical and spiritual conditioning or reconditioning that strikes at the very seed and growth process of the inner self. Eventually, an aura of self-loathing and learned helplessness becomes a norm of negative developmental thought and self-perception." So what this highlights here is symptoms of historical intergenerational trauma that filter from one generation to the next. And just some short examples, loss of land is in there, alcohol tends to filter through the different generations, domestic violence, and when we get down to the next generations, you're looking at gangs and prisons. So Eduardo Duran says that the native idea of historical trauma involves the understanding that the trauma occurred in the spirit or soul. Dr. Karina Walters, she brings to the fore research that has discovered that at a cellular level, stress from one generation can be carried to the next generation. Dr. Bruce Lipton, he's a cellular biologist, and he talks about his experiments in stem cell research. So he says, in one of my experiments, I put stem cells in 3 petri dishes. I then changed the growth medium, the constituents of the environment in each dish. In one dish it formed bone, in the next it formed muscle, and in the final dish it formed fat cells. He said, all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, I realized that here I am teaching at a university in medical school, that genes control the environment. However, he said the cells were actually telling them that genes respond to the environment. So what this is a model that I developed. I called it He Kāpamoa Hau. It's a framework for working with trauma survivors. And I call it moving from trauma to recovery. It has 4 different potama. And on the first level, I utilise the Pōwhiri potama model. And the Pōwhiri potama model was created by Parari Huata. The second model I utilise is the Pūrākau model, which was created by Jacqueline Elkington. The third model I utilise is the Te Whare Tapawha, created by Mason Jury. And the final model I utilise is created by Peter Wai Manawaiti and Dr. Kataraina Mataira. So the theories behind it, the guiding principles are based on Kaupapa Māori worldview. The ethical values based on tikanga Māori. Ethical practices based on Māori ethics. And the outcomes are based on Awanuiarangi. So in terms of the resources, we look at the counselling session itself, the development of protection and safety plans, developing support networks, and also developing preferred stories and strategies for wellness. Now the last one talks about the process itself. So for us, Pōwhiri means establishing the relationship, and Potapa talks about the process of establishing that relationship. So we start in whakamoemiti, and that's about preparing ourselves mentally and spiritually. Then we go to mihi whakatau, and that's about establishing relationships. Then we move to whakapuaki, and that's about establishing and identifying the issues. And then whakatangitangi for us is about bringing forth the mamai. Then we've got whakaratarata, and that's about developing the preferred stories and developing strategies to get there. Then finally we look at whakaoranga, and that's about implementing those preferred stories and those strategies. And then we have whakaotinga, which is about effective closure. Oops. And this is pretty much what the model looks like. And then we go to the Pūrākau model, and it talks about the stages of development in one's life. And this is how I apply it. So the broken heart, they represent the fractured wairoa that happens as a result of trauma. And the Pūrākau model represents the spaces and times of one's life. And And so I call this the dehumanizing of the sacredness of the human spirit, moving it from tapu to no. And then I also talk about the perpetrators of the trauma, those who are supposed to be our nurturers, those who are supposed to be our role models, those who are supposed to be the kaitiakis for the future generations of tomorrow. Now what I have here are two different models, or two different ways of looking at it. The victim-perpetrator model and the learner-teacher model. So it's just a different paradigm, a different way of looking at it. So in terms of the fracture of the wairua, I kind of like look at it as kind of like a stone, and you drop that stone into a pond and it creates those ripples. And this is what the fracture in the wairua has created. And so what it's done is it's rippled into the wairua, it's rippled into the hinangaro, it's rippled into the tinana, and it's rippled into the whānau. And as a result of it, it colours the perceptions and the ways that people see as a result of trauma. So this is tūkiri o te tangata. Now, in Te Whiwhi o Tahu Māori counselling, we talk about a form of mirimiri, and our form of mirimiri is in the reo. And tūkiri o te tangata is one of the models that we use to be able to do that. So when we connect to the Māori, we're asking them, so what's their understanding of their life lessons? To connect to their mana, we're asking them questions like, so how would you describe your worth as a person? In terms of whatu manua, we're asking them, what is it that you hold most dear? So for us, it's about looking at that, the fracture in the wairua, and then going back into history to address each fracture in their wairua, and then we come forward into the future and put parameters in place so that these things don't happen again. The real reason why is so it doesn't spill over into the next generation. And so what we talk about are negative tapes. And what those negative tapes, as a result of going through trauma, they tell us, I can't do that. I can't do these things. And this is what the things that happen as a result. The positive tapes like this. And so really it's about changing the paradigm and say, let's make this one bigger and let's make this one smaller. Yeah. So for us it's about miri ki roto te reo, to our whānau, it's about whakamana, to whakamana them and remove them back from no to tapu, because so that they recognise that they are a kākano, that they come from a line of greatness, that they come from a line of chiefs. So in terms of transforming, this is the overview of the actual intergenerational trauma itself. So ultimately this takes you through a process that really looks at transforming ourselves, transforming our family, transforming our community. So for me, this is a model that I've been working around in terms of transforming society based on Te Tiriti o Waitangi. I'm not too sure of the time limit I've got, so I just thought I would. Gone over it. Yeah, so yes, I'll put it there, and nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, kia ora matata koutou. Any questions?